Welcome to the Global Leaders Hiding in Plain Sight workshop today. As we're giving people a little bit of time to join still, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat and let's cover a little bit of housekeeping. So this workshop can run as smoothly as possible. We ask you that you keep yourself muted and have your video turned off throughout the workshop until we reach the Q&A at the end. You are welcome to ask questions in the chat as they arise so we can be sure to cover them towards the end. I'd like to introduce the host of this workshop. First, we have Joyce Osland, an internationally known specialist in international management with a focus on global leadership, Latin America, and organizational development. She recently retired from her position as the Lucas Endowed Professor of Global Leadership and Executive Director and founder of the Global Leadership Advancement Center at San Jose State University, Lucas College, and Graduate School of Business. This center has trained over 1,400 students in the Global Leadership Lab at SJSU and research training best practices. Next, we have Allan Bird. His professional service includes tenures as president of the Association of Japanese Business Studies, as well as lengthy service on the association's executive committee. He was formerly chair of the Careers Division in the Academy of Management and has served on the executive committee of the International Management Division. He was a key architect and founding member of the International Organization Network, a network of academics and managers from around the world committed to increasing the quality and impact of research on people and their effectiveness in international organizations. And finally, they both have over 150 publications apiece. I will now turn this over to Joyce.
Thank you. It's great to have you all here today. You know, one of the difficulties of doing webinars is we don't get to be in a room with you and we don't get to hear you talk all the time. So that is one of the reasons we did pre-surveys with you. And one of our questions was this, you know, who is a good global leader and why? Now, some of you mentioned your colleagues, which is wonderful and also proves the point that anybody can be a global leader. You don't have to be a big name. But some of the people that you suggested are, in fact, world famous, like here at Hofstede, et cetera. And it starts to raise the issue for us, which we wanted to do, was what is it that makes a good global leader? Next slide, please, Allan. But so another way of getting at that is asking you, who's a bad global leader? And so you didn't hold back on this. As you can see, we've got lots of suggestions here. But what we're seeing in this slide is the beginning of a lot of what I would call nuanced thinking about who's a global leader or why. And it gets at contexts, it gets at conditions that are taking place, it gets at impact. And that is exactly what we struggled with as we tried to figure out what is the exact definition of a global leader. That might sound simple, but we worked on this for several years, pondering away. So Allan, take it away.
So as Joyce noted, we've worked on this for several years, and the challenge is kind of what makes a global leader different than a kind of a typical leader as we've thought about that traditionally. And those are some of the things we hope to unpack as we help you identify the global leaders around you that may be hiding in plain sight. So this was a definition that I should say this is a definition we've currently settled on. And there are a couple of things that are worth noting. One, when we talk about global leadership, we're really talking about a set of processes and actions about what people do. And then when we talk about leaders, we're talking about the individuals who do them. Frequently, we will talk to people and they'll say, well, I'm not a global leader because I don't have that title, or when we ask people to think of global leaders, they immediately think of people with titles. But for us, what's significant is the influence that those individuals have through their actions and through the processes that they pursue in influencing a range of people, both inside and outside the organization. And there's some other characteristics. I think this was best, this concept that anyone could be a global leader is best embodied by Arne Olson at ABB. And if you focus particularly on that opening sentence of his, a local leader can be a global leader, sometimes even more than global colleagues. And I think that's really important. And that's one of the things we'll be focusing on today is where are those people? How can we identify them? And what can we do with them? So Joyce.
Okay. We also asked you, what are the global challenges that you are facing? And when you look at these, a lot of them have to do with COVID, of course. They have to do with complexity. Diversity keeps raising its head, and bridging differences among polarized group, and of course, ethnocentrism. Allan, could you switch it for me? Now, then our next question was, what about your specific field? What are those global challenges that you might face in your field? Well, clients overwhelmed by complexity and nonstop work. Again, we have lack of cultural intelligence and diversity, and basically getting along, conflict, dealing with conflict. Switch. So we asked you to tell us an example of your best leadership story. I always love to read these, and I wish we could share all of them, but I had to pick just one. And I picked this one because it's a good example of the global scope that someone faced in trying to set up a business all across Asia primarily. And look at the goals: building goodwill, securing wins to establish credibility. Again, diversity, building a diverse and dispersed team. Now, if we look at the success factors, in addition to knowledge, it's also intercultural skills, but then we get into personal skills like resilience and persistence. And this is all leading us to what is a major focus in our talk today is competencies. So when I looked at all your success stories, this is what came out. And again, a lot of intercultural skills. And then, of course, things like hard work, trying to make others successful. So all of these are competencies that play an important role in global leadership. Okay.
So now that you've got some sense of how we define global leadership and what we're thinking about, I thought it would be useful to see if we couldn't begin trying to identify some. So right before the session started, we sent out a couple of documents, and if you want to open those and work along with us, or if you just want to pull out a notepad and take some notes, I'm going to ask you a series of questions that are designed to help you identify people in your community, in your organization, that might have some of the characteristics we're looking for that we think about when we talk about global leaders. And so I'm just going to bring some questions up, and I'll talk briefly about them. And I'd encourage you to think about the people you know, the people you work with, or in your community or organization. And then you might also think about how you would evaluate yourself with regard to that particular quality. So one of the first questions, got ahead of myself there, is as you look around, who strikes you as a global systems thinker? Who's paying attention to global news and events, particularly those that impact your organization and industry? Who's someone that seems to be able to quickly connect the dots in terms of making sense of the environment you're operating in? Maybe there's one person, maybe there are several people that do that, but this is a quality that we know is associated with effective global leadership. A second question would be, who always seems to know the right questions to ask? You know, when you're working on something, perhaps working in a team or across teams, who always seems to come up with the right questions and also seems to know who should be asked to better understand problems or to understand what opportunities may exist. As you're thinking about different people, a third type of person to look for is who's good at developing relationships of mutual trust across the organization and across countries. It's interesting, when Joyce and I were engaged in one of our research projects, it often involved going into organizations and asking a simple question: who's good at doing this? When you think of somebody, and almost invariably, when you ask people, they'll say, "Oh, so-and-so is someone who seems to be really good at that." And we found that that's an effective way to begin thinking about how we identify global leaders. Who would you go to if you had a difficult problem in the organization? Who's somebody within the organization has a reputation for tackling and solving difficult problems? Who's good at including people? I can recall a particular project I was involved in, and that I realized partway into the project that I had one team member who was always making suggestions about somebody else that we ought to touch base with, or somebody else that we ought to include in our deliberations. And I realized what a tremendous value that was, and how they were demonstrating some real leadership capability. Finally, who's good at perceiving how your organization is being viewed in other communities, other countries? The handout I've provided you with, called Identifying Global Leaders, has 13 questions. Joyce and I actually have a more extensive list, but I think this can point you in the right direction in finding those leaders that you may not have identified previously as global leaders. So with that as a foundation, and hopefully with a list, or at least some notes on some people immediately around you who are global leaders or have global leadership potential, let's see where we go from there.
Okay. And I just want to say, I'm seeing all these people introducing themselves in chats, and some of whom I know. It's such a joy to see all of you checking in and representing so many different organizations. So these next few slides come from a research program that Allan and I did with some other colleagues on expert cognition and global leaders. And we did exactly what Allan said. We asked companies, who are your truly global leaders? And usually they only came up with one or two. This was a while back, and before people worked so much more globally. But this is how they described their work. As you can see, it's exceedingly difficult. These were not simple tasks that they were doing. And what this tells us is that not only do people need an enormous ability to do something difficult, but they have to have a lot of resilience and perseverance to be able to pull something like this off. Next, please, Allan. When they described how they worked, of course, they talked about things like problem solving, strategic thinking, etc. But what I thought was really fascinating about this, and because we weren't aware of this as much before, is boundary spanning. I always tell the story. I looked in all my leadership textbooks. I looked in the index for boundary spanning, and I didn't find it anywhere. Yes, leaders always do relationships, but boundary spanning is just absolutely crucial for global leaders. And then because they so often don't have direct influence over the many people that they're working with around the world, they have to be really wonderful at influencing, not giving orders, but influencing people. And then I showed the tentative results of this study to Gary Klein, who's one of my heroes. And he looked at it and he said, well, Joyce, these just sound like really smart people. What makes them global? So I went back and I did content analysis again on our transcripts, and I came up with what's on the next slide. So what are these global skills that set global leaders apart? What should we be looking for when we're selecting global leaders? Well, they're really good at reading people. They watch people like a hawk because they know they don't know. They engage in mindful dialogue and active listening to a really superior level. They're very good at taking the perspectives of other people, and they're not fighting for their own perspective all the time, but they're good at figuring out how everyone around the world would react to something, an action that's taken, a memo that goes out. They're the ones in their organizations that are always fighting against parochial organizational views. They're the ones who are coaching others to be more global. And then finally, they're the ones who are really good at engaging in conscious managerial code switching so that they're effective. Now, we stole this term code switching from the field of intercultural communication, but it's exactly what they're doing. They show enormous behavioral flexibility. So this is what makes these people really global. This was a follow-up study that we did on global leaders, but we looked in particular in depth at CEOs of large organizations and what happened. And we used this wonderful research methodology called cognitive task analysis, which distinguishes between experts and novices. So let me explain what you see here. In the first column, the column on the left, you see difficult cognitive elements. So these are elements of cognition that characterize global leaders. And then the second column from the left explains why they're so difficult, in particular, in this particular domain. And then the third column from the left is what novices do. And finally, in the fourth column, so the most right column, that's what experts do. These are the cues and the strategies that they use with respect to each one of these elements. So how is this helpful to us? Well, for one thing, it gives us a much better idea what global leaders are actually thinking and doing. And it also tells us what to be aware of with novices and how we can train them. Now, let me take one of these. Okay, so let's look at understanding other people's. Actually, Allan, could you go back one slide, please? I like number 3 a lot because I've seen it so many times in global leaders. So the element that they need to do is overcoming difficult, unexpected obstacles, which, as you can imagine, are quite common in global work. Why are they difficult? Well, these are sticky problems. They're not easy to solve, and people are resistant to changing. So what is it that novices do? Well, they tend to give up. They tend to yield their position. They tend to keep doing the same influence tactic over and over and over again, even though it doesn't work. In contrast, what experts do is they keep at it. They keep trying to come up with something that'll work. And I mean, it's just amazing all the different things they try. And they get internal and external feedback and help on what they're trying to accomplish. They're always looking for creative win-win solutions and workarounds. And finally, they know when to fight and they know when to concede. So I find these cognitive demand tables are very helpful when we're trying to figure out both who do we select and also how do we train novices to be better at this. Okay, Allan, keep going, please.
Yep.
All right. Now, years ago, a bunch of international management professors sat down and tried to figure out what skills do people really need. And then we adapted this for global leaders, and this became the competency model that we used in our Geo Lab, and this is used in many places around the world. So think of it as starting with global knowledge at the bottom. Now, in reality, we need global knowledge all throughout this pyramid, but it's the base. We also thought about threshold traits, and here this has to do with selection because it's difficult to train people in these things. Either they have integrity or they don't. It's hard unless they have some life-shattering event that really causes them to stop and think. Integrity is kind of a fixed variable for most people. They need humility because they have to be willing to learn. They need curiosity because they have to be willing to learn. And they need that resilience because it's not easy and they have to keep coming back and working harder. Then we have a whole level of attitudes and orientations that are things like global mindset, which is often described as both cognitive complexity and cosmopolitanism. Then we have interpersonal skills, such as mindful communication, building trust in relationships, teaming, etc. And then finally, we have these system skills at the top that incorporate aspects of everything that's below, influencing stakeholders, ethical decisions, building community social capital, fostering innovation, leading change. These are all serious challenges that global leaders have to do that require an enormous amount of both knowledge and skill. So this guides us in terms of our training and also in terms of our selection. Okay, Allan.
Okay, and if I just pick up and go a little bit further with this framework, it starts from the inside with those things most difficult to change or develop, and moves from inside the person to outside the person. And as you look at that move, for example, from interpersonal skills, when you get to the system skills level, a lot of those simply reflect the extension, the influence at a distance, leadership at a distance. And one of the reasons it is that we've framed it in this way is that it's awfully difficult to exercise those system skills if you don't have the interpersonal skills to carry it forward. So that's one way of framing it. And as you're looking for global leaders, and as you're thinking about who has global leadership potential, this framework can help you think about it. Another approach that I've spent a great deal of time on is looking at the competencies that organizations and academics have proposed are prerequisites of global leadership. And this particular list is winnowed down. I think of it as a kind of an umbrella set of competencies that comes from a review of more than 300 different competencies that have been identified. And you can imagine the challenge then in an organization. We encountered one organization that had over 200 competencies that they were trying to identify. Other organizations, had a much smaller number of 7 or 8. And as I spent time with colleagues sifting and sorting through this, it became clear that there were areas where that you could group these competencies into basically 3 broad areas. And the first is what I would call the business and organizational acumen. And within there, again, in each of these areas, I typically would identify 75 or 80. But as you sorted through those competencies, you began to see how there was heavy overlap, and often using different terms but capturing the same idea. But the business and organizational acumen is really around, can you run the business? Can you operate within a large organization? And do you understand it? So that, basic competencies related to vision and strategic thinking or leading change. Do you have business savvy or organizational savvy? And I'm sure as you think about people that you work with, there are people who, as one interview said, there are some people who just get it. They understand what our business is, and they ask the right questions. They know where to look when problems arise. So that those are really key. Can we manage and lead the organization? The second part of this, though, a really critical one, and perhaps the one where so much attention has been directed, has to do with managing people and relationships. And if you think back to the pyramid model that Joyce just talked about, and as you think about some of the challenges you identified in your own, pre-survey responses, a lot of this had revolved around the ability of people, of leaders to value people, to communicate effectively across cultures, who have good interpersonal skills, who are good at empowering others. The work of global leadership, even for local people, in their little areas, often involves helping other people be more effective at doing work, empowering them. And then the last group of competencies really clustered around the ability of global leaders to manage themselves. And Joyce touched upon some of these previously: inquisitiveness, global mindset, flexibility, character or integrity. And I think one of the things that I take away from this is that there is a great deal of consistency as I sifted and sorted through all of these different competencies. The fact that this set of competencies in one form or another kept surfacing tells us something about what global leaders look like, what it is they need to do their jobs effectively. Now, having said that, a second way to approach this is not to ask what do global leaders do, but ask what are the roles that we put people in, and what do those roles require of them. So as you're looking for global leaders, and as you're looking for what you're hoping that the global leaders can accomplish, another way to approach this is to ask, well, what roles have I given this person, or do I want to give this person? And what we discovered is that as we thought about the complexity that pervades so much of this area, that we could break that down into leadership roles that had a great deal of task complexity or a great deal of relationship complexity. And I'll unpack those a little bit more. When we talk about the degree of variety within task, it might be the wide number of tasks that you have to perform. It might be the differences in the nature of the tasks you have to perform. Maybe you have a lot of tasks, but they're all of the same type, as opposed to tasks that push you or pull you in very different directions. When we talk about relationships, we can talk about the degree of interdependence in the relevant relationships. How many relationships am I managing, internally and externally? Who are the stakeholders I'm interacting with? How different are those stakeholders? And then also, how tightly connected are those stakeholders? If I say something to stakeholder X, what are the implications of that with regard to other stakeholders or with regard to things going on internal to the organization? And this led us then to ask the question, how global is your job? And so the second handout we sent out just before the session was a series of questions, 4 simple questions. If you open up that handout, you can kind of work through it and come up with an assessment on your own. But I thought it would be worthwhile, again, just to ask those questions here. And again, if you'll think about your answers, and we generally frame answers in terms of low, moderate, or high. We're not aiming for some significant level of accuracy, but really just get a general sense. And this is something we've done working with organizations we found very valuable in helping people get a sense for just really how complex their job is, and particularly how complex relative to other people they're working with. So a first question, consider how many different elements you deal with in your job. How many different tasks, how many different business units might it include, or different functional areas of the firm? How many different customers, how many different languages and religions? One of my former students, after she graduated, went to work for a consortium of Los Angeles area hospitals. And when I remarked that, when I asked her how she was doing, she said, "Well, I didn't think it was a global job, but I find myself working with 24 nationalities, 7 different religions, and I don't know how many different languages, across the hospital workers." So there's someone who has an extremely complex task environment, given all of that. So as you think about yourself, would you say, your task complexity is low, moderate, or high, and then you can score 1 being low, 3 being high, and 2 being moderate. And this is just a way of kind of getting a sense of where you fit. A second question: how frequent, intense, and unpredictable are the changes in your various task activities? Some people work in highly chaotic environments where their tasks are constantly changing. The clients they're working with may shift overnight, things go in different directions. So again, low, moderate, or high, thinking about your work. Third question: consider how many cultures, work units, functions, organizations you interact with and how different they are. And rate the level of boundary spanning in your job. Joyce talked about this earlier. Well, how much boundary spanning do you do? How much time do you spend at the interface between different organizations or different units or different groups or communities? And then finally, low, moderate, or high with complexity. How many interconnections do you have with constituents, and how much of the work you do depends on them? How much of the work they do depends on you? What's the what's the degree of interdependence? There are actually some very fascinating visual charts I've worked with that help people draw diagrams of what their relationship environment looks like. So if you scored yourself, you could take the first 2 scores for 1 and 2, and those address the task complexity. Questions 3 and 4 address the relationship complexity. And then you can begin to think about the nature of the leadership roles that either you're coping with or the people you're working with are coping with. And this is useful for thinking about what's required of global leaders, because people can be global leaders at different places in the organization, but the nature of their leadership roles will change accordingly. And so someone, for example, who has high relationship complexity and high task complexity might find themselves in that upper right-hand quadrant of having integrative leadership roles. Much of their work involves integrating the work of others, be they individuals or units. And that integration is complicated because the relationships are highly interdependent. And there are many of them. So this is a way in your handout you could work through that briefly. And a final consideration as we go searching for global leaders is to use assessment tools. There are a number of psychometric assessment tools that are available. I've identified 4 of the more popular ones, and I thought it would be useful just to kind of think through. And I'm not going to walk through this list. You'll get a copy of these slides and you can think through it. But some of the things we're concerned about is the reliability of the instrument from a psychometric properties. What are the psychometric properties? And likewise, there are various ways to think about the validity of the instrument. Does it measure what it purports to measure? And what can we find out about it? And then there's obviously some of the more practical considerations. How much does it cost? What audience is it targeted for? How is it delivered? All 4 of these are available online in one form or another. And then and then how widely it can be used, what kind of language it's in. And the point here really is you have a number of tools available to you, including psychometric tools that can help you search out and find global leaders in your organization. So I'm going to hand it off to Joyce. She's going to talk more about one of them.
I'm going to talk about the one of them that the Kozai Group does and created. So this is about the TI, and this is the instrument that we used primarily in our Global Leadership Lab for so many years. It's been used for many reasons, but this is a basic introduction to what it actually measures. It has 3 factors: perception management, which gets at how you look at events and how you perceive and judge them, and how good you deal with how well you deal with ambiguity. Obviously, I had a little trouble with the ambiguity of that sentence. Relationship management, how you develop and maintain relationships with other people who are different from you. And finally, self-management, because we know it's difficult. So there are several things that we have to pay attention to in terms of how kind of well equipped we are to deal with situations like this. So perception management has several factors. Non-judgmentalness is the first, your willingness to withhold or suspend negative judgments about people. And it also includes positive regard. You know, what's your basic stance towards human? Do you leap to conclusions, or do you give them the benefit of the doubt? How curious are you about people who are different from you and different experiences? How well do you tolerate ambiguity? We all know if you're not comfortable with ambiguity, people tend to close down quickly rather than staying with a situation and learning as much about it as possible. How cosmopolitan are you? How interested are you in other countries or their characteristics, etc.? And that measures how much effort you put into that. Oftentimes students will say to me, Joyce, I don't understand why I got a low score in cosmopolitan. I'm an international student. My parents took me on vacation. Well, the short answer is because you didn't take you on a vacation. You know, that doesn't mean that because you've been exposed to these things doesn't mean that you truly are a cosmopolitan or have made that effort on your own. Interest flexibility has to do with how willing you are to adopt new activities in other countries. You know, are you willing to give up American football and play soccer if you're an expatriate in another country? Next. Relationship management is extremely important. How interested are you in people who are different from you? How willing are you, then the next one is how willing are you to build relationships and maintain them? Look at your friendship group. Who's that consist of? People who are pretty much like you, or do you really work at having diverse friends? How good are you at reading emotions and understanding the feelings of other people? How aware are you of your own beliefs, etc.? And more importantly, perhaps, is do you realize the impact that you have on other people? And social flexibility is the code switching that I've mentioned several times. Can you regulate and adapt your behavior to fit in and build positive relationships with other people? Now, our last factor is self-management. You know, how do you keep yourself going in the face of difficult challenges? Or how optimistic are you? Do you have a positive mental outlook towards people and situations? How self-confident are you that you can actually make this work? And then self-identity is very interesting because people who are good in global work can maintain their own values without feeling a need to judge and judge negatively values that are different from their own. The last three dimensions that we have here all have to do with stress management. The first ones had to do with our sense of self. But in terms of stress management, we have emotional resilience, which is enormously important. Can people keep at it and get over failures quickly, because their failures are inevitable in work as difficult as this? What is your non-stress tendency? How are you wired to deal with stress? And then finally, what effort do you take to manage the stress in your life? So all of these things give us a good idea about how well equipped people are to deal with global settings. And some people use this, of course, to find global leaders in their organizations and certainly to train them. Now, our last slide here is a teaser for our next webinar. We notice we haven't mentioned much about how you develop people, and we're planning to have a webinar on that. But one of the things that goes along with assessments that we believe in very strongly is that if you haven't asked people to come up with a personal development plan after they take an assessment, then we believe that you haven't really, in a sense, gotten all the bang for your buck that you can. It's an incomplete process. And we've researched this for many years and used this process with thousands of people and discovered that people are able to improve the competencies that we just mentioned if they have use a personal development plan. And of course, this is to be continued. We'll explain how this works later. Okay, Allan.
Yeah, and let me just add that when people hear personal development plan, they often say, "Oh, well, that's easy." What we've discovered is that it's not quite as easy as it may look or sound, but that there are some things that can be done to make it highly effective. And in our next webinar, we will touch upon those. As we get ready to transition into some question and answer, respond to some of the questions you've had in the chat line, and possibly may come up subsequently. Before we go there, I wanted to point out that there are a number of excellent resources available. First of all, Joyce and several colleagues are editors of it's an annual volume, but I prefer to think of it as an annual journal publication called Advances in Global Leadership. And this is a great resource. It has not only academic work, but also a great deal of practitioner work. And you'll also find some excellent resources on global leadership development there. I would say that the other major resource is the third edition of Global Leadership Research Practice and Development, which is kind of become the lead handbook, the lead resource in the area of global leadership. And if you haven't taken a look at that, I think it addresses many questions. It certainly covers many topics. So you might want to search that out. Perhaps most practical and useful at the moment is the handout you'll receive following this webinar, which is a list of recommended readings, a fairly extensive list, and I would say a targeted list that contains lots of useful information. We are personally familiar with every article. We contributed to many of them, but we try to stay abreast of the field and think you'll find tremendous value there. And I think that leads us then to open the floor for questions, and I'll turn the time back over to our moderator, Randy.
Great.
I'm going to drop out of the slides and let us share our views of each other.
Okay, great. Yeah, we've gotten 2 questions so far, but everybody please put in some more. I guess the first question is, Joyce, Allan, would love to know one of your specific research sources to cite when presenting my coaching consulting services to potential clients. I will only do developmental work with clients, not one-off training. What would be one of the articles in your AGL?
And that has to do with coaching primarily?
Yes, so she said...
that has to do, hi, this is Elizabeth Talija. Hi, great.
Hey.
Yeah, just something for credibility to be able to say, well, look, the studies show that when you engage in developmental work over time, we do see results in someone's leadership capabilities.
You know, I'm thinking I'd have to look this up, but I think that Richard Boyatzis has published on that. So check into his work. He has done a lot of really good work on coaching and has a good coaching model. But I would look at him. And then I got up from my chair because I wanted to grab a book. Now, this is a very new article that just came out. It's by Natalia Fay. Just a second here. It's in Advances in Global Leadership. And what she did is she looked at all the research. It's kind of a literature review on that had to do a lot with coaching. So I think that you might find some things in there too. So because it's literature review, I would definitely check that out.
Thank you. How do you spell her name? Faye?
F-E-Y.
F-E-Y. Okay. Okay. Yeah, she's familiar. But also, from your advances in global leadership, what are the studies that you and Allan have done that show, like when you're using the GCI and you work with clients over a period of time, kind of like what Michael Page did with the Georgetown Consortium, showing that it's not like you're talking about that student who says, "Oh, I'm cosmopolitan." Right. We don't learn culture code switching through osmosis.
Well, so today, an article coming out today just about this very thing, Elizabeth. I didn't tell her to ask me about this, but anyway, we gave the shorter version of the GCI, which is called the IES, in a pre and post fashion to, I'd say 148 students in our geo lab just recently. And we found out two things. That lab is really carefully designed to be like a global lab. We're trying to replicate the situations that global leaders experience. It's all based on research. And it also replicates what it's like to be in another country as best we can, right? And what we found was that the students did improve all their dimensions in the IAS improved as a result of the 15-week course. But then the other interesting thing we found, which I thought was fascinating, is that about 23% of the students who came in had study abroad experience. And they were significantly higher in two of those dimensions. But at the end of the class, the other students who hadn't had that experience had caught up to the time one measure of the study abroad students. And I thought that was just great news. I mean, of course, the study abroad people had gone on and advanced even more, but it proves that if you're really mindful about how you design things, you can replicate, for example, study abroad experiences without leaving the country. Not that I think that's better, but you know what I'm saying. If you can't leave the country, at least you can design. Okay.
Let me chime in here. We've done some work with a colleague in Japan, Nori Furuya, and he's worked extensively and in a coaching capacity. Some of those studies are only available in Japanese, but he has found significant progress. And I would say there are two ways to look at the use of the GCI in that assessment and development capacity. One, we have an extensive study. It's I believe it's listed in our recommended readings that was published in Journal of International Business Study. He's a lead author, where we found that people who had higher scores to begin with when sent on international assignments performed at a higher level than those, with lower scores. But then the interesting thing we found is they also got more out of those international assignments. That is in a range of managerial capabilities and behaviors. They made advances beyond those who had lower scores. And then they were also better able to transfer what they had learned on those international assignments when repatriated back, which speaks to the value of assessment and using assessment as part of a selection process. But the second part of his work is really focused on, okay, if I'm in coaching roles, and he's worked with a number of Japanese organizations and traced the impact of coaching. In one organization, he was coaching 15 selected managers, tabbed for future promotion. 14 of the 15 all experienced significant gains in their GCI scores, but also in their performance appraisals within the organization. And interestingly enough, the one who didn't, and this is worth noting, the one who didn't experience those was in a position where his supervisor, his boss, did not support this employee, this manager's participation in the program, was opposed to the coaching, and quite frankly actively worked to disadvantage this employee, which speaks to a second aspect of this. The coaching and the developmental practice can be helpful, but it has to take place in a supportive environment. And that sometimes that gets lost or overlooked in the shifts. Not so much that you have somebody actively fighting it, but if there isn't, I would say if there isn't active support, then the potential impact is reduced.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a number of questions that come in, so let's try to get through a couple more. The next question is, thank you for this webinar. My question is, where does eco-literacy or eco-responsibility fit into modern global leadership? Allan or Joyce?
I'd like to take that. There is a large and growing area in global leadership called responsible global leadership. And I think, I can't remember if we cited anything about that on the recommendation list, but if anyone is interested, I can tell you where to find that. The key authors in that area are Pless, Pless, and Maak. They write a lot together. Günter Stahl writes a lot on that. So it's not just, I would say it's not just about environmentalism, but it's about, it includes various social concerns that people have. And, I personally was delighted to see so much emphasis placed on that part of the field. Now, I would say that's one of the most growing parts of the field right now.
Great, thanks.
Well, and I can report that the one of the readings, Developing Responsible Global Leaders, by Mock, Pless, and Baraka, is in the recommended readings, and you can follow you can follow leads from that article to some of the others that Joyce mentioned.
And there's a chapter on that in that global leadership book that Allan mentioned too, the Black Book.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Next question. In your research, have you considered developments in the field of vertical development for leaders? I work with change-wise leadership agility and believe that higher levels of leadership development can be a meta competency to include the competencies required of global leaders. I'm keen for your point of view.
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in that, and I believe very firmly that we've tried. Well, we've certainly tried to do that in the lab, and we try to do that in all the training that we do, because we need to change the way people think and the way they behave. So, yes, my answer is yes, it's very important.
Yeah.
Great. How do you see emotional intelligence assessment intersecting with global assessment?
Let me take that. I see a high degree of overlap in the emotional intelligence and the relationship management. I think that the distinction I see between the two, and I think particularly of our own instruments that we've developed, is that the emotional intelligence measures are general, and what we've tried to do is to zero in on the specifics of people who are different, who are more diverse, either culturally or across other characteristics, and that's an important distinction. There are people who can score well on emotional. Generally, people who score well on emotional intelligence assessments score reasonably well on the on what I would say the emotional intelligence related measures that we have, but we do find instances where there are differences, where people who have broad emotional intelligence struggle with people who are really quite different from them. And Joyce mentioned earlier this notion of kind of, it can be easy to establish relationships and build relationships with people who are similar to us, and we may do that very naturally. It is more challenging to seek out people who are different than us and develop relationships, really meaningful relationships, and that's where there may be some convergence between the two.
Great. Another question: do these GL frames work with domestic relationships across cultures, histories, and social experiences?
Do you want to take that, Joyce, or shall I?
Yeah, why don't you take it?
Short answer is yes. We've spent a fair amount of time looking at this because I would say not recently, but earlier in the global leadership research field, there was a great deal of discussion about what's different. And Joyce got at one of the differences, which is the boundary spanning. Beyond that is the stress level given the global environment. So when you take off, when you take those aspects away, if we're thinking purely in a domestic context, in the U.S., then that means I only have to work across 5 time zones, not forgetting Hawaii in there, as opposed to working across, a far greater number. But the same skills, if you've developed, I would say, I view the global leadership capabilities and people who are effective at that level as having downwardly capable. If you take somebody from a highly complex context where they've been successful, they have the capability to function in a less complex environment. The only question that stands out is one of motivation. There are a great many rewards, personal rewards, psychological rewards from accomplishing work in a highly complex environment. And when you take people out of that complex environment, they may feel less motivated. They may feel less challenged in that scaled back environment. We find this, just in the research among expatriates, people who were in those highly stimulating expatriate positions and then are transferred back home, and that work isn't as stimulating, it isn't as challenging. And so I would say that's the one concern I would have, is if someone's been effective in that global context, what's their motivational level? What's their sense of being challenged?
Great, thank you. We have time for one last question. Is there a comparative analysis of different assessment tools? Thanks.
Yes. In the third edition, I have a chapter with Mike Stevens, one of the other Kozai partners, and Mike is the psychometrician of the two of us. We have gone through, and we've done in that chapter, we did a comparison not just of global leadership tools. The table I shared with you today is an abridgment of that, of a larger table we did there that also looked at intercultural assessments as well. There are, depending on who you talk to, anywhere from 40 up to 115. I'm working with a group of colleagues academically who have identified 115 different intercultural assessment tools. The question is always, I think the more challenging question is what are the comparisons on? Is it the number of languages? Typically, my approach and my interest is on the reliability and validity questions. Do these instruments measure what they purport to measure, and do they do that in a reliable fashion? And this is a challenging area when we talk about global leadership and measuring global leadership competencies. First, we have to agree on what the competencies are, and then we have to agree on how we'll measure them. At Northeastern University, I developed a global leadership assessment center that was evaluating those competencies, not just psychometrically, but behaviorally, and also in terms of written work. And each of those methods reveals different things. It gets at different aspects that can't be got at from the others. And so this is a real challenge, but the short answer is yes, there's a table that does that comparison.
Thank you. That was my question. And if and when you have a second, that would be really great if you can share a reference to that publication. Thank you.
And Marion, we hear from Marion.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Hi, Marion.
Hi, Joyce. Oh, no, but we talked about my question.
Oh, you got your question asked?
I was the one who works with leadership agility. The model that I work is Joyner and Joseph's from their book. And when you look at the highest level that they can research, which is the catalyst level of development, what struck me was the synergy between looking at cultural intelligence and then looking at the emotional and cognitive capacities of someone at a catalyst level of leadership development, that it was like a meta competency. And I think there's a real synergy there, but it's never been researched. And I've never seen it much referred to. So it was interesting to say that you have at least looked at it and considered it.
Yeah. Thank you, Marion.
You're welcome.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Would you guys, Allan, Joyce, like to say any last minute remaining comments?
Well, I'll just make a note, given Larissa's request for a reference. On the slides that you'll receive, and you may have noticed this during the presentation, wherever we have research that supports what we've shared, that reference has been listed at the bottom of the slide. So when you get the slide deck, if you have specific questions about this framework or that competency, I would say check the reference first. And if that doesn't help, then circle back and ask us. Beyond that, all I would say is thank you for sharing your time with us. We hope this has been rewarding.